There's a tale that echoes through these parts, one that folks still whisper about when the wind dies down and the night grows long. I've told it many times, tried to capture the essence of what happened that fateful summer of 1875, but somehow words never seem to do it justice. Still, this story needs telling. A story of deception, courage, and how the smallest spark can ignite a fire that burns the tallest trees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Shadow Creek was never much to look at, just another dusty town carved out of the territory's unforgiving earth. The kind of place where hope comes to die, they used to say. A single street lined with weathered buildings, a church that hadn't seen a preacher in 3 months, and a saloon that did more business than all other establishments combined. But beneath that worthless dirt lay something that men would kill for: silver. Pure and rich. A vein that could make a man wealthy beyond his dreams. Or dead before sundown. Most folks around here can still remember how it was before the troubles started. Shadow Creek wasn't prosperous, but it was peaceful. Families worked their land, raised their children, and minded their own business. That all changed the day Jebediah Rattler Blackwood and his raiders rode in. They came like a plague, quiet at first, working through the proper channels. Mayor Harrison, God rest his corrupted soul, he played right into their hands, helping them buy up land for pennies on the dollar. Those who wouldn't sell? Well, accidents have a way of happening out here in the wild. The Thompsons were the first to learn that harsh truth. Their place burned one night, flames reaching up to paint the sky orange. By morning, nothing was left but ashes and a warning. The Millers were next, then the Robertsons. Each time, Sheriff Hawkins would ride out, make his notes, and declare it another unfortunate accident. Everyone knew better, but knowing and proving are different creatures entirely. That's how things stood when she rode into town. Nobody paid much mind to the woman in the dusty sunbonnet, another settler looking to carve out a piece of heaven from the devil's own backyard. She staked her claim on a patch of earth north of town. Worthless scrub, or so everyone thought. Victoria Thorne, she called herself, though some would later say that name was just another lie in a tapestry of deception. I remember the morning everything started to turn. The sun hadn't yet burned the dew off the sage when Mayor Harrison was in his office, nursing his guilty conscience with a bottle of bourbon. Rattler paid him an unexpected visit, bringing the smell of gunpowder and fear with him. The mayor's hands shook as he tried to explain about the settler woman's claim, the one piece of land they needed most. Just one woman, Harrison had stammered, whiskey courage failing him. Surely your boys can handle it. But Rattler, he was smarter than that. His reputation for violence was matched only by his cunning. This needs to be clean, he'd said, voice carrying that signature rattle that gave him his name. Legal-like. Silver that pure brings questions, and questions bring law we don't need. So they sent the sheriff instead, Thomas Hawkins, a man who wore his badge like it was made of lead, heavy with the weight of compromise. He rode out to her homestead that very morning with 2 deputies, found her working in a small garden like she hadn't a care in the world. The morning sun caught her just right, and for a moment, she looked almost ethereal, like a spirit rather than flesh and blood. Young Jimmy Foster was with him that day. Later, he'd tell me how she never seemed afraid, not even when they mentioned the raiders. Just smiled, soft and dangerous as a rattler coiled in the shade. She took their envelope of money without opening it and promised to consider their offer. But there was something in her eyes that made Jimmy's skin crawl, something that didn't belong in the eyes of a simple settler woman. Eleanor Cooper, Nell to most folks, she saw it too. Running the general store, Nell saw everything that happened in Shadow Creek. She watched Victoria walk into her store that same morning, that unopened envelope in her hand, moving with a grace that spoke of something more than homesteading. Silver, Nell had told her, voice barely above a whisper, glancing around her empty store like the walls might have ears. They found it last week. Blackwood's been buying up everything he can, one way or another. And those who won't sell? Victoria had asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. They leave. Or they vanish. Nell's words hung in the air like gunsmoke. 12 families since spring. The Thompson place was the last, burned to the ground 3 weeks ago. Their little girl still wakes up screaming most nights. That's when something changed in Victoria's eyes, a flash of steel beneath the settler's gentle facade. Later folks would say that was the moment everything truly began, though none of us knew it then. The way she held herself changed, just for a second, like a card player accidentally showing their hand. That evening, she passed Rattler and his men outside the saloon. The way they watched her, like wolves eyeing a lamb, would have made most women quicken their step. But Victoria, she kept her pace steady, even stopped when Rattler called out to her, his men fingering their gun belts with poorly hidden anticipation. "Hope you're finding our little town hospitable, ma'am," he'd said, voice dripping with false courtesy. "Quite hospitable," she'd answered, head tilted just so, keeping her face shadowed by that worn sunbonnet. "Though I hear the climate can be unpredictable. Only for those who don't know how to read the signs." His hand had rested on his gun, casual as a snake in the sun. "Storm's coming. Hate to see anyone caught unprepared. Don't worry about me, sir." She'd mounted up smooth as silk, the movement too practiced for a simple settler. "I always weather the storm." Watching her ride away, even Rattler felt something wasn't right. He sent Ezra Banks to watch her place, learn her habits. "Everyone's hiding something in Shadow Creek," he'd told his men, eyes narrow with suspicion. "Question is, what's she hiding?" If he'd known the answer to that question, he might have run while he still had the chance. But that's getting ahead of the story. Folks say truth is a funny thing out here in the territory. As changeable as a rattlesnake's path in the sand. What seems clear in the morning light can twist into something else entirely, come sunset. That's how it was with Victoria Thorne. The more people watched her, the less they seemed to know. Ezra Banks spent 3 days studying her place from the hills above. He was the best tracker the raiders had, and could read signs like most men read newspapers. But something about Victoria's routine didn't sit right with him. Each morning, she'd work her garden, tend to a few chickens, just like any settler woman. But there were moments, brief as a shadow crossing the sun, when she'd stop, head tilted just so like she was listening to something only she could hear. "She knows I'm watching," Ezra told Rattler on the 4th morning, his usual confidence shaken. "Don't ask me how, but she knows." Rattler wasn't one to spook easy, but he'd learned to trust Ezra's instincts. "What else?" "She rides out every afternoon, same time. Says she's checking her fence line, but—" Ezra paused, choosing his words careful as a man crossing thin ice. "She's too good on that horse. Sits it like a cavalry officer." That got Rattler's attention. He was cleaning his revolver, a habit he had when thinking deep. "You think she's law?" "Law don't send women," Scarface Turner spat from his corner. "She's just some uppity homesteader who needs teaching her place." But Rattler wasn't convinced. He remembered stories from the war, whispers about a ghost that haunted Confederate camps, a shooter that could appear and disappear like morning mist, leaving dead men in their wake. Some said it was a woman, but that was too fantastic for most to believe. That same afternoon, Victoria rode into town for supplies. The summer heat had driven most folks indoors, leaving the street empty save for a few hardy souls. Among them was Dr. Samuel Green, tending to young Tommy Wilson's broken arm outside his office. "Afternoon, Miss Thorne," the doctor called out as she passed. "How's that shoulder healing?" She reined her horse to a stop, and those watching later swore they saw her hand twitch ever so slightly. "Just fine, doctor, though I don't recall mentioning any shoulder trouble." The doctor's face went pale as fresh milk. "Must be thinking of another patient. Old age playing tricks on my memory." Victoria nodded, but her eyes had gone hard as gunmetal. "Must be—" Inside the general store, Nell Cooper was waiting. She closed the door behind Victoria, turning the sign to closed despite the early hour. "You've got trouble coming," she said without preamble. "Rattler's brother Lucas just rode in with fresh men. They're planning something." They usually are. Victoria began selecting supplies with careful deliberation. "Any word on the missing Carter family?" "Found their wagon yesterday, out by Devil's Fork. Empty." Nell's voice caught. "Sheriff won't even ride out to look?" Victoria's hand paused over a bin of nails. "How many children?" "3. Youngest was just 4. The silence that followed had weight to it, heavy as a hangman's rope. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice had changed. Gone was the settler's gentle tone, replaced by something harder. "Tell me about Lucas Clayton. Mean as his brother, but not half as smart. Likes to make people suffer." Nell hesitated. "They say he's the one who actually set the Thompson fire. Made them watch it burn." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria nodded once, sharp as a gunshot. "I think it's time I paid my respects to the sheriff. Been meaning to do that since I arrived." She found Thomas Hawkins in his office, boots on his desk, hat tipped low like he was sleeping, but his hand was never far from his gun. "Miss Thorne," he said without looking up, "come to reconsider the offer?" "Actually, I came to ask about the Carters." She stayed in the doorway, shadows stretching long across his floor. "Seems odd, a whole family disappearing like that. Lots of things can happen on the trail, Indians, bandits, or raiders." The sheriff's boots hit the floor with a thud. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am. Wouldn't want to go spreading rumors without proof." "Proof?" Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Like the proof you ignored when the Thompsons' place burned? Or the proof you buried Marcus Miller after they found him with a bullet in his back?" Hawkins stood slowly, his face dark as a thunderhead. "You're new here, Miss Thorne. Don't understand how things work. For your own safety, I suggest you take that offer and move on." "Or what, Sheriff? I might have an accident." "Accidents happen all the time out here." He moved around the desk, trying to crowd her space. "Sometimes to people who ask too many questions." But Victoria didn't back down. If anything, she seemed to grow taller, her presence filling the room like smoke before a fire. "Yes, they do. But so do other things. Things that make accidents look like child's play." She left him standing there, the threat hanging between them like a coiled rope. Outside, the street had grown busier. Lucas Blackwood and his fresh riders were making their presence known, intimidating shopkeepers, harassing passers-by. Victoria watched them from the boardwalk, her expression hidden by that ever-present sunbonnet. Young Jimmy Foster hurried up to her, his deputy's badge still shiny as a new penny. "Miss Thorne," he said, voice low and urgent, "you need to be careful. Lucas, he's different from Rattler. Doesn't care about looking legal." "I appreciate the warning, deputy." She touched the brim of her bonnet in acknowledgement. "But I learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous snake isn't the one making all the noise." As if to prove her point, Lucas chose that moment to notice her. He swaggered over, reeking of cheap whiskey and expensive tobacco. "Well, well, you must be the stubborn little lady giving my brother such trouble." "Mr. Blackwood." She nodded politely. "I wasn't aware property rights were in trouble." "Everything's trouble out here, darling." He reached for her bonnet. "Less you know how to be friendly-like." What happened next was so quick. Most folks who saw it still argue about the details. Lucas's hand never reached her. Somehow he ended up face down in the dirt, his arm bent at an angle nature never intended. Victoria hadn't appeared to move at all. "My apologies," she said, calm as a morning prayer. "I'm rather particular about who touches my things." She walked away, leaving Lucas cursing in the dust. But those who looked close might have noticed something. For just a moment, her dress had shifted, revealing the faintest glint of steel strapped to her leg. The war was about to begin in earnest, though none of us knew it then. We just knew that something had changed, like the shift in wind before a storm. And in Shadow Creek, storms had a way of turning deadly. The thing about pride is it can make a man do foolish things, especially when it's been wounded in public. Lucas Blackwood had been humiliated in front of the whole town, and that kind of shamed a man's blood. But Rattler, he knew better than to let his brother's rage dictate their moves. He'd built his empire on patience, on choosing the right moment to strike. That evening, the raiders gathered at their camp outside town. The firelight painted their faces in shades of hell as Lucas paced, his arm in a crude sling. "We should burn her out tonight," he snarled. "Show everyone what happens when you cross the Blackwoods." "And bring every marshal within 100 miles down on us?" Rattler cleaned his gun with practiced strokes. "Number. There's something about this woman we're missing." "Ezra?" The tracker shifted uncomfortably. "Been asking around. Nobody knows where she came from. No family, no past. But here's the strange part. She paid for her land in gold eagles. Fresh ones, mint-stamped last year." "Government money," Scarface Turner muttered. "Has to be law." "Maybe." Rattler chambered around, the click echoing in the darkness. "Or maybe she's something else entirely. Remember their stories during the war? About that ghost shooter that hit Confederate camps?" Lucas snorted. "That's just campfire talk. Besides, they said that the ghost was a man." "Did they?" Rattler stood, his shadow stretching tall against the canyon wall. "Or was that just what people assumed? Either way, we need to know what we're dealing with." "Frank?" Frank Two-Gun Thompson stepped forward. He was the Raiders' best shot, claiming he could put a bullet through a wedding ring at 50 paces. "Yeah, boss. Time to introduce yourself to the lady. Nothing too obvious, just get her talking. See if you can spot any calls." But Frank never got the chance. As he saddled up the next morning, young Tommy Wilson came running into camp, face white as a ghost. "Raiders! Raiders! They found the Carter kids!" The news spread through Shadow Creek like wildfire. 3 children, half-starved but alive, had wandered into the miller's old place just before dawn. They told a tale that set every tongue in town wagging. Someone had rescued them from the men holding their family, someone wearing a dark hood who moved like a shadow. "It was like magic," the oldest boy told Dr. Green as he tended their cuts and bruises. "One minute the bad men were playing cards, the next they were all sleeping. The shadow person told us to run east and said our ma and pa would be waiting at Miller Place. But John and Mary Carter weren't there. Instead, the children found a note, written in a flowing hand. 'Your parents are safe. Justice is coming.' When Sheriff Hawkins heard the news, he rode straight to Victoria's homestead, 2 deputies in tow. They found her mending a fence, looking for all the world like she'd been there all morning. 'Quite a story they Carter kids are telling,' Hawkins said, his hand resting casually like on his gun. 'You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?' Victoria drove another nail into the post. Wonderful news, them being found. Their poor parents must be beside themselves with worry." "Funny you should mention their parents." Hawkins dismounted, boots raising dust. "Seems they've gone missing too, along with 4 men who were camped up by Eagle's Ridge." "Missing?" Victoria tested the fence post with a firm shake. "Like Marcus Miller went missing." The sheriff's face darkened. "I'm going to give you one chance to come clean. Are you working for the government?" "I'm just a settler, Sheriff." She smiled, and something in that smile made his blood run cold. "Though I've heard that government agents have been asking questions about certain disappearances in these parts. Families gone missing, homesteads burned. Curious thing, isn't it?" Before Hawkins could respond, hoofbeats thundered up the trail. It was Jimmy Foster, riding hard. "Sheriff! Sheriff! There's been a shooting in town." They found Frank Thompson sprawled in the dirt outside the saloon, 2 bullets in his chest. His guns were still in their holsters, never cleared of leather. Whatever had happened, it had happened fast. Witness says he was bragging about paying a visit to some lady settler, Jimmy reported, his young face troubled. Next thing anyone knew, he was reaching for his guns. Nobody saw who shot him. Victoria stood in the crowd that gathered, watching as they carried Frank's body to the undertaker's. Nell Cooper appeared at her side, speaking low. They're saying it was the ghost. Same one that saved them, Carter kids. Ghosts don't use bullets, Mrs. Cooper. No? Nell's eyes were sharp as needles. Then what do they use? Victoria just smiled and walked away, but those standing close swore they heard her whisper, "Justice." That night, Rattler called his men together again. The fire had burned low, casting more shadows than light. Two-Gun Thompson was the best shot I ever knew, he said, his voice carrying that deadly rattle. Nobody that fast except who? Lucas demanded. Except the Phantom. Rattler's eyes reflected the dying flames. During the war there were stories. A shooter that could outgun any man alive. They called them the Phantom because nobody ever saw their face, just a dark hood and the flash of their guns. Confederate command offered $10,000 in gold for them, dead or alive. What happened? They disappeared after the war. Some said they died, others said they were hunting something. Rattler stood, decision made. Ezra, ride to Copper Creek. Tell Jackson we need every man he can spare. Lucas, get word to the other camps. I want 20 guns here by sunset tomorrow. You really think one person could be worth all that? Scarface asked. Rattler checked his gun, a habit that had kept him alive this long. If I'm right about who we're dealing with, 20 might not be enough. But first, he turned to Lucas. Pay a visit to the good doctor. Man's been acting mighty strange lately. Maybe he knows something about our mysterious settler. As Rattler's men rode out into the darkness, a figure watched from the shadows of Victoria's porch. The moonlight caught the metallic glint of a badge. Not a sheriff's star, but something else. Something that hadn't been seen in these parts for a very long time. The war was about to change, and Shadow Creek was caught in the middle. But then, that's what happens when you build your fortune on other people's misery. Sooner or later, misery comes looking for its due. Dawn hadn't yet broken when they came for Dr. Green. Lucas Blackwood and 3 of his men kicked in the doctor's door, expecting to find him sleeping. Instead, they found an empty bed and a note on the pillow. Too late. It was written in the same flowing hand as the message left for the Carter children. The room still held warmth, coffee cups on the table still half full. They'd missed him by mere minutes. The news hit Rattler like a physical blow. He'd been counting on the doctor knowing something, anything, about the mysterious woman who'd turned his well-laid plans to dust. But now Green had vanished, just like the Carters, just like the men at Eagles Ridge. The pieces were there, but they formed a picture he didn't want to see. Somebody's helping her, Lucas growled, nursing his wounded pride and arm. Has to be. One woman couldn't do all this alone. His voice echoed off the canyon walls where the raiders had made camp, making him sound small against the vastness of the territory. But Rattler wasn't so sure. He remembered something else from those war stories, something that made his scalp prickle. They said the Phantom never worked alone, but not because they had help. They said the Phantom could be in 2 places at once, like a spirit walking between worlds. He'd laughed at those stories once. He wasn't laughing now. That morning, Victoria rode into town as if nothing had changed. The early light caught her horse's coat, making it shine like burnished copper. She tied her horse outside the general store, but before she could step inside, Sheriff Hawkins intercepted her, his boots leaving dark prints in the morning dew. Dr. Green's missing, he said without preamble. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? His hand rested on his gun belt, thumb brushing the hammer of his revolver. Seems a lot of people go missing in Shadow Creek. Victoria adjusted her sunbonnet, keeping her face in shadow. Perhaps you should spend less time questioning honest settlers and more time investigating why that is. You're no settler, Hawkins moved closer, trying to use his height to intimidate. I sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office. Interesting thing, they never heard of Victoria Thorne. Did you expect them to? The question hung between them like smoke after a gunshot. Before Hawkins could respond, a commotion erupted from the saloon. Two of Rattler's men had cornered young Jimmy Foster, accusing him of spying on their camp. The boy's back was against the wall, his deputy's badge catching the morning light like a desperate wink. "I wasn't spying," Jimmy's voice cracked with fear. "I was just patrolling, like the sheriff ordered." "Patrolling awfully close to our business, boy." Scarface Turner drew his gun, the metal gleaming dully in the morning light. "Maybe we ought to teach you about respecting private property." The scars on his face twisted as he smiled, making him look like a creature from a nightmare. What happened next became part of Shadow Creek legend. Victoria moved like lightning, her hand emerging from the folds of her dress with something that flashed silver in the sun. Scarface's gun went flying, a tiny throwing knife embedded in his wrist. His partner barely had time to reach for his own weapon before another blade appeared, pinning his sleeve to the saloon wall. The street went dead silent. Victoria stood between Jimmy and the raiders, and suddenly she looked nothing like a settler woman. Her stance was pure gunfighter, balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction. The morning wind tugged at her skirts, revealing the faintest outline of holstered weapons beneath. "Interesting skills for a homesteader," Sheriff Hawkins said softly, his own gun now drawn. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the early hour. "Interesting company for a lawman," Victoria replied, nodding towards the wounded raiders. "Tell me, Sheriff, how much does Rattler pay for your badge?" "That's enough." The voice came from the end of the street. Rattler Blackwood himself stood there, flanked by half a dozen riders. Their horses' hooves clattered on the packed earth, an ominous drumbeat of approaching violence. "I've been patient, Miss Thorne, but my patience has limits. You've interfered with my business, assaulted my men, and now you're throwing around accusations that could get people killed." "People are already dying, Mr. Blackwood." Victoria's voice carried clear and cold mountain water. "Families burned out, witnesses vanishing, honest folk driven from their homes. Did you think no one would ever stand against you?" "Stand against me?" Rattler laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Look around you, woman. I own this town. Every street, every building, every sad soul trying to scratch out a living. Even if you are who I think you are, you're just one person." "Am I?" Victoria's smile was sharp as a razor. "Ask your men at Eagles Ridge." "Oh wait, you can't. They're gone." "Ask Frank Thompson." "Oh right, he's dead." "Ask Dr. Green, but he's vanished too. Seems to me your grip on this town isn't as tight as you think." Rattler's face darkened. His hand twitched near his gun, a movement that had spelled death for countless men before. "Last chance. Take the money and ride out, or I promise you won't live to see the sunset." Funny thing about promises. Victoria's hand moved to her bonnet, fingers gripping the brim. They're just words until somebody backs them up. She lifted the bonnet away, and a collective gasp ran through the crowd. Her hair was silver as moonlight, cut short as a boy's. But it was her eyes that caught everyone's attention, cold and hard as frozen steel, with a look that had seen too much death to fear it anymore. The morning sun caught her face, revealing a thin scar that ran from temple to jaw, a souvenir from another life. "I know you," Rattler breathed. "Columbia, 63. You're the one who led 200 Union prisoners to freedom?" Victoria's smile never wavered. "Burned Sherman's path to Atlanta? Made grown men fear shadows?" "I've been called many things, Mr. Blackwood. The Phantom, the Ghost, the Shadow Shooter. But right now you can call me Justice. Long overdue justice." The street had emptied, townfolk ducking into doorways and behind wagons. Nobody wanted to be caught in what was coming. Sheriff Hawkins stood frozen, his gun still drawn but uncertainty plain on his face. The very air seemed to crackle with tension, like the moment before a lightning strike. "Sunset," Rattler said finally, his voice carrying that deadly rattle. My men against whatever ghost army you think you have. We'll settle this once and for all. No, Mr. Blackwood. Victoria's voice was soft as falling snow and twice as cold. We'll settle it now. The war was about to explode, and Shadow Creek held its breath, waiting to see which way the blood would flow. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, nature itself seeming to acknowledge the coming storm. Time has a way of slowing down just before bullets start flying. Every detail burns itself into memory. The way dust motes dance in the morning light, the creak of leather as men shift in their saddles, the soft whisper of wind through the streets of Shadow Creek. The sun painted long shadows across weathered boardwalks, each shadow a finger pointing toward what was about to unfold. In that frozen moment, Victoria Thorne stood alone against Rattler Blackwood and his men, her silver hair catching the sun like polished steel. You really want to do this now? Rattler's voice carried that signature warning sound, his fingers drumming an unconscious rhythm on his gun belt. In broad daylight with witnesses? Witnesses are exactly what this town needs. Victoria's hands hung loose at her sides, nowhere near her hidden weapons. The morning breeze tugged at her skirts, revealing glimpses of the steel beneath. They need to see what happens when good people stand up to men like you. A bitter laugh erupted from Lucas Blackwood, who had managed to pull himself back into his saddle despite his wounds. Good people. You're nothing but a killer yourself. How many men did you send to their graves during the war? How many widows did you make? Only those who chose the wrong side of justice. Her eyes swept the gathered crowd, meeting each gaze in turn. Like you're choosing now. That's when Nell Cooper stepped out of her store, shotgun cradled in her arms like a child. The widow's face showed no fear, only grim determination. She's not alone. Her voice rang clear in the morning air, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. Not anymore. One by one, others emerged from the shadows of porches and alleyways. Old Bob Peterson from the blacksmith shop carrying his heavy hammer, soot still marking his forearms. The Thompson girls, their faces tight with the memory of their father's murder. Even young Tommy Wilson, his broken arm still in its sling. Each face showed the same determination, fear mixed with something stronger, something that had been buried under Rattler's boot for too long. This is touching, Rattler sneered, though his eyes darted from armed citizen to armed citizen counting threats. But foolish. You really think a bunch of shopkeepers and women can stand against my raiders? They won't have to. Victoria's voice changed, becoming the voice that had commanded men in battle, that had whispered hope to prisoners in dark cells. Because this ends between you and me. Sheriff Hawkins shifted nervously, his badge catching the light like a guilty thing. Now, hold on. Still trying to play both sides, Sheriff. Victoria never took her eyes off Rattler. Why don't you tell everyone what really happened to Marcus Miller? How did you help cover up his murder? The crowd murmured. Hawkins's face went pale as fresh linen. That's a lie. Ask him about the gold you found on Miller's body, Victoria continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the street. The same gold you're wearing on your watch chain right now. The sheriff's hand moved to his vest where a gold chain gleamed in the morning sun. The crowd's murmur grew louder, angry bees in a disturbed hive. Enough! Rattler's patience snapped like a dry twig. Killer! What happened next seemed impossible even to those who witnessed it. Victoria moved like smoke in a high wind, her body flowing between bullets as if she could read their paths. Her first shot took Scarface Turner's gun hand, spinning him like a top. Her second knocked Lucas Blackwood from his saddle again, this time to stay. 2 more raiders fell before anyone could blink, their bullets hitting nothing but air where she'd been standing. Then she was behind Rattler's men. 2 guns appearing in her hands as if by magic. Silver-plated Colts with pearl handles, the weapons of legend. Drop them, she commanded, or join your friends in the dirt. But raiders don't surrender easily. One of them, a young gun named Billy Hicks, tried to be a hero. He spun, gun blazing, and died before his bullet left the barrel. Victoria's shot went through his heart with surgical precision, the sound like a blacksmith's hammer striking iron. Next, her voice was cold as a mountain stream. The remaining raiders looked to Rattler, who had gone very still. "The Phantom," he said softly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "They said you died at Gettysburg. Stories of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Victoria kept both guns steady, sunset reflecting off their silver plates. "Unlike the stories about what happens to those who cross my path." That's when Jimmy Foster's young voice cut through the tension. "More riders coming. From the east." Indeed, a cloud of dust marked the approach of at least 20 men, the reinforcements Rattler had sent for. But Victoria just smiled, the expression making hardened killers take a step back. "Right on time," she said. From the alley beside the saloon emerged Dr. Green, no longer looking like the timid physician everyone knew. He held a rifle with military precision, and behind him came John and Mary Carter, armed and ready, vengeance burning in their eyes. "The Carters?" Sheriff Hawkins sputtered. "But we're helping set a trap," Victoria finished. "Just like they helped me track down every dirty secret you and Rattler have buried in these hills." More figures appeared on the rooftops, faces that Shadow Creek knew well. The missing families, the supposedly dead witnesses, all returned like ghosts to haunt their tormentors. Each one carried a rifle, and each rifle pointed at the raiders below. "You see, Mr. Blackwood," Victoria's smile held no warmth. "While you were watching me, they were watching you. Every meeting, every payoff, every murder ordered. We have proof of it all." "Proof?" Rattler laughed, but there was fear in it now. "Proof means nothing out here." "Maybe not to you." Victoria nodded toward the east. "But I think the U.S. Marshals riding this way might disagree." The approaching riders were close enough now to see their badges glinting in the sun. Rattler's face twisted with rage. "Do you think this changes anything? I still own this town." "No," came a new voice. Mayor Harrison stepped into the street, papers clutched in his shaking hands, looking like a man who'd been carrying hell on his shoulders. "Not anymore. I've signed confessions about everything. The land theft, the murders, all of it. May God forgive me." The mayor looked 20 years older, broken by guilt and fear. But his words hit Rattler like physical blows. The raiders' empire was crumbling, and everyone could see it. "It's over," Victoria said quietly. "Though I expect you'll want to do this the hard way." Rattler's hand twitched toward his gun. "You always were clever, but I've got nothing left to lose." Thunder rolled across the mountains again, nature's own warning of the storm about to break. Shadow Creek held its breath, waiting to see which legend would fall and which would rise from the coming chaos of lead and gunsmoke. They say you can smell death coming, like ozone before a storm. The air in Shadow Creek carried that scent now, mixed with dust and gunsmoke and fear. Rattler Blackwood's hand hovered near his gun, his eyes locked with Victoria's across the empty street. The morning sun cast their shadows long and dark against the weathered boards of the saloon, two figures frozen in time. Behind Rattler, his remaining men spread out, trying to find angles that wouldn't leave them exposed to the armed citizens on the rooftops. "One last chance," Victoria offered, her voice carrying clear in the morning stillness. The wind tugged at her silver hair, no longer hidden by pretense. "Surrender to the marshals. Face justice in a proper court." Rattler's laugh was sharp as broken glass, his eyes holding the cold calculation of a predator. "Justice? From the woman who killed her way across 3 states during the war? How many men died in Columbia that night, Phantom? How many families did you leave without fathers?" 14, Victoria answered without hesitation, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "All of them chose to guard prisoners rather than fight on the front lines. All of them are willing to watch good men starve in chains. Each one made their choice." 15, came a voice from behind Rattler. Ezra Banks, the tracker, stepped forward. His weathered face held old pain as his hand moved to his collar, pulling it down to reveal an old scar that gleamed silver in the morning light. There were 15 men in that prison camp. One survived. Understanding flickered across Victoria's face. The boy. The one who tried to stop me. Who showed mercy. Wasn't much more than a kid, Ezra agreed, his voice thick with memory. Too young to know better. You could have killed me that night. Should have. By rights. You dropped your gun, showed mercy to the prisoners. Victoria's eyes never left Rattler, even as she spoke to Ezra. That's the only reason you lived, the only reason you earned that chance. The tracker nodded slowly, his hand unconsciously touching the scar. Been tracking you ever since. Follow your ghost stories across the territory. The shadow of Atlanta, the ghost of Gettysburg. Never thought I'd find you here playing settler in a town like this. I wasn't playing. For the first time, emotion cracked through Victoria's iron control, like lightning through storm clouds. This land, this town, I chose it. Thought maybe I could finally stop running, build something real, find peace. And instead, you found us. Rattler's voice carried that deadly rattle, the sound that had warned so many men of their coming death. Found more men needed killing, found another war to fight. No. Victoria's denial was sharp as a whip crack. I found people who needed protecting. Found men who'd forgotten that power comes with responsibility, found a chance to make something right. The approaching marshals were closer now, their horses' hooves drumming a rhythm of approaching judgment across the hard-packed earth. But everyone knew they wouldn't arrive in time. This would end here, in the dust of Shadow Creek's main street, where so many other stories had ended before. You want to talk about responsibility? Rattler's face twisted with a sneer. I built something here, brought order to chaos. These people need a strong hand to guide them. Need someone to show them the way. Like you guided the Thompson family? Nell Cooper's voice rang out from her position by the store, heavy with years of suppressed anger. Burning their home with their children inside? Or Marcus Miller? Dr. Green added from his alley, rifle steady in his hands. Shot in the back while pleading for his life? Or my deputies? Sheriff Hawkins suddenly spoke, surprising everyone. He'd removed his badge, letting it fall in the dust like the burden it had become. The ones who actually tried to uphold the law before you bought me with golden threats? One by one, the townspeople called out their accusations, years of fear and anger finally finding a voice. Each word seemed to age Rattler, turning him from frightening legend to cornered animal before their eyes. Shut up, he roared, spittle flying from his lips. All of you, shut your goddamn mouths. They won't be silenced anymore, Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. Your empire of fear ends today, one way or another. That's when Lucas Blackwood, still nursing his wounds and burning with humiliation, made his final mistake. To hell with this. He drew, attempting to shoot Victoria in the back. 3 shots rang out as one. Victoria's, Ezra's, and young Jimmy Foster's. Lucas fell dead, his gun unfired, his face showing surprise that his own end had finally found him. His body hit the dirt with a finality that seemed to echo through the street. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, everyone waiting to see how Rattler would react to his brother's death. His face went through a cascade of emotions. Shock, grief, rage, before settling into something harder than stone. Well, Phantom, he said, his voice carrying that final warning rattle. Guess we do this the hard way after all. What happened next would be debated in saloons and around campfires for years to come. Some say Rattler was faster, that his bullet actually grazed Victoria's cheek before her own shot found its mark. Others swear she never even drew, that her guns simply appeared in her hands as if by magic. The only thing everyone agrees on is the result. 2 shots, 2 bodies in the dust. But only one rose again. Victoria stood over Rattler's fallen form, smoke still curling from her Colt. The famous gunman looked almost peaceful, his face relaxed in death in a way it never had in life. His gun lay beside him, the barrel still hot from his final shot. "It's done," she said simply. And in those 2 words lay the weight of years of pursuit, of justice long delayed, but finally served. Ezra Banks approached her slowly, his hands well away from his weapons. "What happens now?" She studied him for a long moment, seeing not the hardened tracker, but the boy who'd shown mercy so many years ago. "That depends. Are you still hunting ghosts?" The tracker smiled, touching his old scar. "Think I'm done with ghosts. But this town might need some help rebuilding, making things right." "It will," Victoria agreed, looking around at the faces of the townspeople emerging from their hiding places. "More than you know." The morning sun had risen fully now, burning away the shadows that had hidden so many secrets. Shadow Creek would never be the same, but then, that had been the point all along. Sometimes, Victoria knew, the only way to build something new was to let the old burn away, like a forest after a cleansing fire. In the hours that followed Rattler's fall, Shadow Creek seemed to wake from a long nightmare. The U.S. Marshals took charge of the surviving raiders, loading them into wagons for the long journey to territorial prison. Their badges caught the sun as they worked, glinting like stars fallen to earth. The townspeople moved through the streets in a daze, as if unable to believe their freedom had been bought so suddenly, with just 2 shots and a lifetime of courage. Victoria stood on the boardwalk outside Nell Cooper's store, watching as they carried away the bodies. Rattler and Lucas Blackwood would be buried outside of town, in unmarked graves that would soon be forgotten. Their empire of fear reduced to nothing more than 2 patches of disturbed earth. "Never thought I'd see this day," Nell said, coming to stand beside her. The shopkeeper's shotgun was still warm from the morning's events. "Kept waiting for someone to stand up to them. Never figured it'd be a woman in a sunbonnet. Sometimes the best hiding place is right in plain sight." Victoria's hand brushed the scar on her cheek, no longer hidden by careful angles and shadow. "Though I didn't come here looking for a fight." "No." Ezra Banks approached, his tracker's stride silent even on the wooden boards. "Then why did you come?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching as Dr. Green tended to those with minor wounds from the shooting. "During the war, I saw the worst of what men could do to each other. Afterwards, I hunted down those who'd escaped justice. But you can't live on vengeance forever." "The land deed," Nell said suddenly, understanding dawning. "It really was just about the land for you, wasn't it? My father had a farm in Pennsylvania. Before the war, before everything changed, I thought," Victoria's voice caught, "I thought maybe I could build something like that here. Something honest." The sound of hammering drew their attention. Down the street, old Bob Peterson was already at work, repairing bullet holes in the saloon's facade. Other townspeople were emerging, beginning the work of reclaiming their town. Young Tommy Wilson ran past, his broken arm forgotten in the excitement of the day. "Maybe you still can," Ezra offered. "Town's going to need leadership now, someone who knows the difference between strength and tyranny." Victoria shook her head. "I'm not cut out for that kind of responsibility. Too much blood on these hands." "Whose blood?" Jimmy Foster challenged, approaching with his deputy's badge newly polished. "Rattler's? His raiders? Men who chose to prey on the innocent?" The young man's face was earnest, determined. "Way I see it, sometimes justice needs bloody hands to get done." Mayor Harrison emerged from his office looking older but somehow lighter. The weight of guilt had been replaced by the burden of redemption. "The boy's right. Shadow Creek needs to be rebuilt, but not just the buildings. We need to rebuild trust, faith in the law. And you think I'm the one to help with that?" Victoria's laugh held no humor. "I'm a relic of the war, Mayor. A ghost that should have faded long ago." "No," came a new voice. Sheriff Hawkins approached, his badge conspicuously absent. You're exactly what this town needs. Someone who understands both sides of justice, the law, and what happens when the law fails. The former sheriff held out his badge, its silver surface catching the sun. I wore this for all the wrong reasons. Maybe it's time someone wore it for the right ones. Victoria stared at the badge, her expression unreadable. You're offering me a dead man's star. I'm offering you a chance, Hawkins corrected. A chance to build something real, like you wanted. Only instead of one piece of land, you'd be helping rebuild an entire town. The U.S. Marshal in charge, a weathered man named Curtis, joined the conversation. We could deputize you officially, give you the authority to make real changes here. And if I say no? Victoria's hand had drifted to her guns, a habit born of years of survival. Then you ride away, Nell said simply. Go find another town, another fight. But you and I both know that's not what you want anymore. A warm wind blew down the street, carrying the scent of sage and promise. In the distance, thunder still rumbled, but it was moving away now, taking the storm with it. Victoria looked around at the faces watching her. Ezra with his old scar and new purpose, Jimmy with his young determination, Nell with her quiet strength, and all the others who had stood up when it mattered. It won't be easy, she said finally. This town's got a lot of healing to do. Good thing we've got a doctor then, Green called out, drawing laughs from the gathered crowd. And a blacksmith, old Bob added, raising his hammer. And a few folks who remember what it means to stand together, Nell finished. Victoria reached out slowly, her fingers closing around the badge. The silver felt warm, alive with possibility. I won't wear a dead man's star, she said, but maybe it's time for a new kind of law in Shadow Creek. One that remembers justice isn't just about punishment. It's about protection. Then we'd best get to work, Ezra said, touching his old scar with a smile. Lots of ghosts lay to rest. As the sun climbed higher, Shadow Creek began to stir with new purpose. The Undertaker dealt with the dead while the living looked to tomorrow. Victoria Thorne, once known as the Phantom, stood watch over it all, her silver hair catching the light like a beacon of change. Some said later that they saw her bury her war-worn Colts that evening, out under the cottonwood tree where she'd first staked her claim. Others swore she kept them close, a reminder of what happens when good people stay silent too long. The truth, as always in the territory, probably lay somewhere in between. What no one disputed was this. Shadow Creek had found its protector, and the ghost of war had finally found her peace. Autumn came early to Shadow Creek that year, painting the hills in shades of gold and crimson. 3 months had passed since Rattler Blackwood's fall, and the town had changed like the seasons. The bullet holes in the saloon's facade had been patched, the bloodstains scrubbed from the street, but deeper changes marked the town's transformation. Where once people hurried through the streets with heads down and voices hushed, now they walked tall. Children played in the open, their laughter carrying on the cooling breeze. The fear that had gripped Shadow Creek for so long had finally released its hold, like winter giving way to spring. Victoria Thorne's homestead still stood north of town, but she spent more time in her small office next to the jail. The badge she wore wasn't Hawkins's tainted star. She'd had old Bob Peterson forge a new one, simple and clean. A fresh start, she'd said, deserves fresh silver. On this particular morning, she sat at her desk reviewing reports when Ezra Banks entered, trail dust still clinging to his clothes. Found another one, he said without preamble, dropping a handful of papers on her desk. Cave up in the high country. Looks like Rattler had been stockpiling weapons, planning something big. Victoria studied the papers, manifests, shipping orders, letters that painted a darker picture than anyone had imagined. He was building an army. More than that. Ezra pulled up a chair, his old scar catching the lamplight. Found correspondence with 3 other gangs. He was aiming to take control of the whole territory, use Shadow Creek as his base of operations. Then we stopped him just in time. She looked up as Jimmy Foster entered, the young deputy's badge sitting proud on his chest. What's the word from town? Already thought of that, Ezra smiled. Remember those army contacts you had during the war? Sent some letters, called in some favors. Got 6 experienced men willing to come serve as deputies. All of them fought alongside you in one campaign or another." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "The Ghost Battalion? They remember what you did for them. Figure they owe you a debt." "No one owes me anything," she said sharply, but her expression softened. "Though we could use the help." "There's something else," Nell added. "The territorial governor is sending a circuit judge next month. I want to establish a proper courthouse here. Says Shadow Creek could become a model for other frontier towns." Victoria touched her badge, feeling its weight. From Rattler's Kingdom to a model of justice. Quite a change. Change was always coming, Mayor Harrison said quietly. Question was whether it would break us or make us stronger. The morning sun broke through the clouds then, painting Shadow Creek in shades of promise. Victoria watched as Dr. Green helped Mrs. Thompson with her groceries, as children played marbles in the street without fear. This was what she'd fought for, what so many had died for. Not just the absence of evil, but the presence of good. "Well," she said finally, "we've got work to do. Ezra, I want you and Jimmy to map out those weapon caches, make sure we haven't missed any. Nell, see what you can do about organizing housing for when the mining families start arriving. Mayor, we'll need to draft some new ordinances. Keep the peace before it's broken." As they moved to their tasks, Victoria remained at the window for a moment longer. Her reflection showed a different woman than the one who'd ridden into town in a sunbonnet, older perhaps, but more at peace. The silver in her hair caught the light like a corona, no longer a mark of war but a badge of wisdom hard won. Shadow Creek was changing, and so was she. The ghost of war had found her place at last, not in vengeance but in protection, not in fear but in hope. And if trouble came looking for the town again, well, some legends never truly die. They just find new reasons to live. Winter descended on Shadow Creek like a soft blanket, snow turning the once dusty streets into lanes of pristine white. The town had grown in the month since Rattler's fall, new buildings rising against the mountain backdrop, the promised railroad spur inching closer with each passing week. But it wasn't just the town that had changed. Its people had transformed too, standing taller, speaking louder, living without the shadow of fear that had haunted them for so long. On this particular morning, Victoria stood at her office window, watching as the first mining families arrived in wagons wrapped against the cold. Each family brought not just hopes for prosperity, but the promise of new beginnings. Among them, she recognized faces from other troubled towns, people who'd heard that Shadow Creek was different, that here the law meant something more than just a badge and a gun. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Ezra's voice came from behind her. The tracker had grown comfortable in his role as senior deputy, his old scar now a badge of honor rather than a mark of vengeance. 23 families just this week, towns growing faster than we expected. Too fast? Victoria turned from the window, concerned about etching her features. Not with the new deputies settling in. Ezra smiled, touching the badge that now matched his purpose. The ghost battalions already made quite an impression. Stopped 3 claim jumpers yesterday without firing a shot. Your old comrades haven't forgotten what you taught them about justice being more than just gunsmoke. The mention of her old war companions brought a rare smile to Victoria's face. The 6 men who'd arrived to serve as deputies were more than just lawmen. They were living proof that the past could be redeemed, that soldiers could become peacekeepers, that war's ghosts could find peace in protection rather than violence. Their conversation was interrupted by Jimmy Foster's hurried entrance, bringing the cold with him. "Got word from Marshal Curtis," he announced, shaking snow from his coat. "They finished the last of the raider trials, 17 convictions, including those who helped hide Rattler's operations in other towns." "And the witnesses?" Victoria asked, thinking of the families who'd risked everything to testify, who'd found their courage in Shadow Creek's example. All safe. Territories made good on its promises, new lands, compensation for their losses. Jimmy's young face showed pride in the justice they'd helped deliver. "Marshall says Shadow Creek is becoming something of a legend. The town that broke the back of frontier lawlessness, he called it. Victoria snorted at that. Towns don't break anything. People do, when they decide to stand together against what's wrong. As if to punctuate her words, the sound of hammering drifted in from outside. Old Bob Peterson was helping the new arrivals build their homes, his skilled hands teaching others the craft of creation, rather than destruction. Nearby, Dr. Green had set up a proper clinic, with Mary Carter serving as his nurse. The girl who'd once feared shadows now walked in sunlight, helping others heal. Got something else you should see, Ezra said, producing a worn leather journal. Found it in that last weapons cache. Rattler's personal diary. Victoria took the book carefully, its pages heavy with the weight of dark deeds. Have you read it? Enough to understand what we really stopped here. Ezra's voice was grim. He had connections with corrupt officials all through the territory. Shadow Creek was just the beginning. He was building a network of controlled towns, planning to effectively run his own kingdom. The weapons stockpiles, Jimmy breathed. He was planning a war. More than that, Victoria said, scanning the pages. He was planning to become the very thing we fought against in the larger war, a power that ruled through fear and corruption rather than justice and law. Nell Cooper entered then, bringing her customary basket of food and news from the town. The new schoolhouse is almost finished, she reported. 30 children signed up for classes, can you imagine? A proper school in Shadow Creek. Victoria could imagine it. Had been imagining it since the day she first staked her claim. But the reality was proving even better than her dreams. The town was becoming not just a place of law and order, but of learning, of healing, of growth. There's something else, Nell added, her voice softer. The territorial governor's coming next month. Wants to see this miracle for himself and to offer you something. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What kind of something? They're establishing a new position, Territory Marshal for the Western District. They want someone who understands both sides of the law, someone who can help other towns do what we did here. The room fell silent, snow falling outside the window like nature holding its breath. Victoria's hand moved to her badge, not the old, tarnished star of a compromised sheriff, but the clean silver of a new beginning. I didn't come here looking for power, she said finally. No, Ezra agreed. You came looking for peace, but maybe this is how you find it, by helping others find their own justice, their own strength. Jimmy stepped forward, his young face earnest. The Ghost Battalions trained me well. With Ezra's help, we could handle things here. Shadow Creek's strong now, strong enough to share its strength with others. Victoria moved to the window again, watching the life flowing through the streets below. Children having snowball fights where once bullets had flown. Women walking freely where once they'd hurried in fear. Men building homes instead of fortifying hideouts. When I came here, she said slowly, I thought I was done with war. Done with fighting. Thought I could just tend my garden and find some quiet corner of peace. And instead, Nell prompted, instead, I found something worth fighting for. Something bigger than revenge or justice. Victoria turned to face her friends, her family really. I found hope. The snow continued to fall outside, each flake a promise of renewal. Shadow Creek had changed her as much as she had changed it. The ghost of war had become something else, not a phantom of vengeance, but a guardian of possibility. Perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. 6 months into Victoria's role as Territory Marshal, trouble rode into Shadow Creek on a storm-laden wind. The summer heat had baked the earth hard as iron, and dust devils danced through streets that had grown busy with commerce and life. But even as the town prospered, dark whispers began to spread across the territory. Whispers of someone collecting Rattler's scattered forces, building something dangerous in the shadows. The news came with Frank Morton, one of Victoria's old war companions, now serving as a deputy in Rivers Bend, 2 days' ride south. He arrived at dusk, his horse lathered with effort, his face grim with urgency. "They're calling themselves the Shadow Legion," he reported to Victoria in her office, while Ezra and Jimmy Foster listened intently. "Started small, just a few of Rattler's old boys who slipped through our nets. But they're growing, and they're smart about it." Victoria studied the map spread across her desk, marking the locations of recent raids. Pattern to it? That's what caught my attention. Frank placed markers on various towns. They're not just hitting random targets. They're systematically taking control of key transport routes, mining claims, and water rights, building the same kind of empire Rattler dreamed of, but more carefully. "And now they're moving towards Shadow Creek," Ezra added, his tracker's instincts reading the map's story, "following the railroad's path." "Makes sense," Jimmy said, older now and wiser in the ways of trouble. "Shadow Creek's become a symbol. Take it down, prove that what we built here can be broken. And every other town that's tried to follow our example loses hope," Victoria finished. She touched her marshal's badge, remembering the weight of other battles, other choices. "Who's leading them?" Frank's face darkened. "That's the real trouble. Remember Colonel James Blackwood?" The name hit like a physical blow. Victoria's hand went to her scar unconsciously. Rattler's uncle, the one who trained him. "The same," Frank confirmed. "He was a Confederate cavalry officer known for his guerrilla tactics. After the war, he disappeared south of the border. Now he's back, and he's got more than revenge on his mind. He's got vision. And resources," Ezra added. "Found traces of Mexican silver in their payments. He's been building support from across the border." Victoria moved to the window, watching her town in the gathering dusk. Children played in the street while their parents shopped at Nell's store. Dr. Green was teaching Mary Carter about setting bones, their heads bent over medical texts in the clinic's window. The bank's new vault door gleamed in the sunset, old Bob Peterson's craftsmanship a symbol of the town's prosperity. "We knew this peace wouldn't last forever," she said quietly. "The price of freedom is eternal vigilance." "Question is," Jimmy ventured, "do we wait for them to come to us? Or do we take the fight to them?" Victoria turned back to her deputies, and something of the old phantom showed in her eyes. Not bloodlust, but the cold calculation of someone who understood that sometimes peace had to be defended with force. "Neither," she said. "We do what we did before. We build something stronger than fear." She bent over the map again, her finger tracing the railroad's path. "Frank, ride to River's Bend. Tell them what's coming. Ezra, I want you and 2 deputies checking every trail, every pass leading to town. Jimmy, work with old Bob. We need more than just a bank vault. We need the whole town ready." "And you?" Ezra asked, though something in his face suggested he already knew. "I'm going to pay a visit to an old friend." Victoria's hand moved to her hidden Colts, carried now not for revenge, but for protection. "Colonel Blackwood isn't the only one who made connections during the war. Time to call in some favors." As her deputies moved to their tasks, Nell Cooper entered with her customary basket of food. But this time, her expression was troubled. "War coming again?" "Not if we can help it," Victoria replied. "But if it does, we'll face it the same way we faced Rattler. Together, standing in the light, not hiding in shadows." Thunder rolled across the mountains, nature's own warning of storms to come. But Shadow Creek had weathered storms before. The town that had broken Rattler's power had grown stronger in the breaking, its people bound together by more than just survival. As night fell, Victoria rode out alone, her silver hair catching the last light like a beacon. Behind her, Shadow Creek glowed with lamplight and life, a fortress built not of walls, but of will, not of fear, but of hope. The war for the territory's soul was about to begin, but this time the Phantom wouldn't fight as a ghost of vengeance. She would fight as a protector of dreams, a guardian of the future that Shadow Creek had dared to build, and she wouldn't fight alone. 3 days hard riding brought Victoria to a place she'd thought never to see again. The old mission of San Miguel, its adobe walls glowing golden in the desert sunrise. Hidden in the mountains along the Mexican border, it had served as a way station during the war, sheltering escaped prisoners and Union sympathizers. Now it housed a different kind of refugee, those who had chosen to lay down their guns and seek peace. Father Miguel himself met her at the gate, his weathered face breaking into a smile. The phantom riding out of legend once more? He embraced her like a daughter. Though I hear they call you Marshal now. Times change, Father. Victoria dismounted, her bones aching from the ride. Though some things stay the same, Colonel Blackwood has returned. The priest's face darkened. We've heard whispers. His Shadow Legion has been recruiting south of the border, offering Mexican bandits American targets. He led her into the mission's cool interior. But you didn't ride 3 days just to tell me what I already know. No. Victoria accepted the cup of water he offered. I need to know about the other survivors, the ones who chose to disappear after the war. Ah, Father Miguel's eyes held understanding. You're building an army of your own. Not an army, something better. She pulled out a carefully folded document, the governor's authorization. I'm building a future, and I need people who understand the difference between justice and revenge. The priest studied her for a long moment. There are 12 here who might suit your purpose. Men who fought alongside you, who learned the cost of violence and the value of peace, but they've found sanctuary here. Why should they risk that? Because sanctuary isn't the same as redemption. Victoria's voice carried the weight of experience. They chose peace, yes, but now they have a chance to defend it, not with violence, but with courage. As if summoned by her words, figures emerged from the mission's shadows. Men she remembered from battles long past, their faces older, but their eyes still sharp. Among them was Joshua Hayes, once her second-in-command in the Ghost Battalion. We've been watching the territory, Hayes said without preamble. Blackwood's building is more than just a criminal empire. He's trying to create chaos, break the peace town by town until there's nothing left but fear. Just like his nephew tried in Shadow Creek, Victoria agreed. But we stopped Rattler. Rattler was a mad dog, another man spoke up. Michael Chen, their old scout. The colonel is a general. He thinks in campaigns, not just battles. Victoria nodded. That's why I'm here. Shadow Creek showed that one town could stand against tyranny. Now we need to show that all towns can stand together. You're talking about an alliance, Hayes said thoughtfully. Not just law enforcement, but a network of communities protecting each other. Exactly. Victoria spread out a map on the mission's old table. The railroad's given us connections we never had before. Telegraph lines are going up. We can share information, resources, and warnings. Create something stronger than any outlaw army. Father Miguel watched the exchange with knowing eyes. You're not just fighting Blackwood's Shadow Legion. You're fighting the very idea that violence and fear are the only ways to rule the frontier. The war taught us all something different, Victoria replied. It taught us that the real strength isn't in how many guns you have, but in how many people stand together against injustice. One by one, the men gathered closer, studying the map, seeing not just trails and towns, but possibilities. These were men who had once fought for great causes, who had laid down their arms in search of peace. Now they were being offered a chance to fight for something again. Not with bullets, but with brotherhood. Shadow Creek won't stand alone, Hayes said finally. But we'll need more than just fighters. We'll need builders, healers, teachers, people who can help towns grow strong enough to resist fear. Victoria smiled. Already ahead of you. Dr. Green has been training other physicians. Old Bob Peterson's teaching apprentices not just blacksmithing, but how to fortify buildings smartly. Even Mary Carter started a network of nurses. Creating strength from within. Father Miguel nodded approvingly. But Blackwood won't wait while you build. His legion grows stronger every day. That's why we need to move fast. Victoria pointed to key locations on the map. These towns are most vulnerable. We start there, show them they're not alone. Create a chain of cooperation that even the Shadow Legion can't break. It won't be easy, Chen warned. Some towns might be too scared to stand up. Others might already have Legion sympathizers in positions of power. Nothing worth doing is ever easy, Victoria replied. But we have something Blackwood doesn't understand. Hope. The same hope that helped Shadow Creek find its courage. As the sun set behind the mission's walls, plans were made and promises given. 12 men who had once fought for the Union would ride again. Not as soldiers, but as builders of a different kind of peace. Each would take responsibility for a section of the territory, working with local law enforcement, teaching towns to protect themselves. "What shall we call ourselves?" Hayes asked as they prepared to depart. "Can't very well be the Ghost Battalion anymore?" Victoria thought of Shadow Creek, of how it had transformed from a place of darkness to a beacon of light. "We'll be the Dawn Riders," she said, "because we're bringing a new day to the territory." As she mounted up to return to Shadow Creek, Father Miguel blessed them all. "Remember," he said, "the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy. It's transforming them into friends." Victoria rode north under a sky bright with stars, carrying with her not just plans but possibilities. The Shadow Legion was coming, yes, but they would find more than just one town ready to stand against them. They would find hope, riding out to meet them in the dawn. The Shadow Legion struck at midnight, but not where anyone expected. While Victoria was still a day's ride from Shadow Creek, Colonel Blackwood's forces hit 3 towns simultaneously. Not Shadow Creek itself, but the settlements that supplied it. Miller's Crossing with its grain stores, Fort Pine with its lumber, and Rivers Bend with its cattle. Word reached Victoria through a network of riders the Dawn Patrol had established. She found Ezra waiting at Copper Creek, his tracker's face grim in the lamplight of the way station. "It's worse than we thought," he reported as they rode hard toward home. "Blackwood's not just trying to break Shadow Creek, he's trying to starve it. Cut off every supply line, every ally until we're standing alone." "Smart," Victoria admitted, remembering old war strategies. "He's using Shadow Creek's strength against it. The more we've grown, the more we depend on trade." Thunder rolled across the mountains, and with it came the rain, a deluge that turned the trail to mud and reduced visibility to arm's length. But they couldn't afford to stop. Every hour counted now. They reached Shadow Creek just before dawn to find the town already preparing for siege. Old Bob Peterson had transformed his smithy into an armory, teaching townspeople how to repair weapons and forge ammunition. Dr. Green and Mary Carter were converting the new schoolhouse into an emergency hospital. Every able body was working, driven by the same determination that had once broken Rattler's power. "Report," Victoria commanded, striding into her office where Jimmy Foster waited with a circle of Dawn Riders. "Miller's Crossing held," Jimmy said proudly. "That training we gave them paid off. The Legion tried to burn the granaries, but the town militia was ready. Drove them off with minimal casualties." "Fort Pine wasn't so lucky," Joshua Hayes added grimly. "They got the sawmill. Towns are still standing, but they'll need help rebuilding." "And Rivers Bend?" Michael Chen stepped forward, his scout's eyes haunted. "That's where it gets interesting. The Legion didn't just raid, they offered protection. Said if the town pledged loyalty to Blackwood, they'd be spared future attacks." Victoria's hand went to her scar, remembering similar tactics from the war. "How many took the offer?" "Too many," Chen admitted. "Fear's a powerful motivator, especially when it wears a smile." The room fell silent, each person understanding the implications. Blackwood wasn't just attacking their supplies, he was attacking their unity, turning neighbor against neighbor with a combination of violence and false promises. "He's trying to make us look weak," Ezra concluded. "Show everyone that Shadow Creek's way doesn't work." "No." Victoria's voice carried that old steel. "He's trying to make us act weak, respond with fear instead of courage. If we strike back blindly, we prove his point that violence is the only answer. She moved to the map table, where markers showed the Legion's known positions. But if we show these towns a better way, if we help them rebuild, protect them without controlling them, we prove something else entirely. We'll need resources, Jimmy pointed out. Can't help others if we can't feed ourselves. That's when Nell Cooper entered, bringing not just her usual basket, but news. The Chinese merchants from Silver City sent word. They're offering us their supply routes through the mountains. Said they remember how Shadow Creek welcomed their people when other towns turned them away. Victoria smiled. Once again, past kindness was bearing unexpected fruit. Get word to Hayes and the other Dawn Riders. We're not just defending towns anymore. We're building bridges between them. Every community that stands with us makes Blackwood's shadow smaller. But even as they planned, more riders arrived with urgent news. The Legion was gathering its full strength, preparing for something big. Scouts reported over 100 men moving through the night, all converging on a single location. Not Shadow Creek, Ezra said, studying the reports. They're heading for the territorial capital. Understanding dawned in Victoria's eyes. Of course. Blackwood's not trying to destroy law and order. He's trying to replace it, take the capital, install his own government, make his protection official. Can we stop them? Jimmy asked the question everyone was thinking. Victoria looked around the room at faces that had become family. Ezra with his redemption scar, Jimmy with his young courage, Nell with her quiet strength. Beyond them, she could see Shadow Creek going about its business, people helping people, building something stronger than fear. We already have, she said quietly. Everything we've built here, every town we've helped stand up for itself, it's all been preparation for this moment. Blackwood thinks he's gathering an army to break the territory's spirit, but we've been gathering something stronger. She turned to her deputies, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won wisdom. Send word to every town, every settlement. Tell them what's coming, but don't ask them to fight. Ask them to stand. Together. In the light. The way Shadow Creek did. And if they're scared, Chen asked, tell them about a town that was scared too, that lived under a killer's boot until one day it chose to be something more. Victoria touched her marshal's badge, remembering her own journey from vengeance to protection. Tell them fear only has power if you face it alone. As her deputies rode out into the rain-soaked night, carrying messages of hope instead of warnings of doom, Victoria stood at her window. Shadow Creek glowed in the darkness, each light a beacon of defiance against the gathering storm. The final battle for the territory's soul was coming, but it wouldn't be fought with guns alone. It would be fought with courage and compassion, with unity and understanding, with all the things that had transformed a phantom of war into a protector of peace. Dawn was coming, and with it, a choice that would echo through generations. Dawn broke over the territorial capital like a revelation. Colonel Blackwood's Shadow Legion arrived expecting to find a city cowering in fear. Instead, they found something unprecedented in the history of the frontier: unity. Every street was filled with people, not soldiers, not gunfighters, but ordinary citizens standing shoulder to shoulder. Shopkeepers from Shadow Creek stood beside ranchers from River's Bend. Chinese merchants from Silver City linked arms with Mexican farmers from San Miguel. The Dawn Riders were there too, not as warriors, but as witnesses, their presence a reminder of how far they'd all come from the days of war. Victoria Thorne sat her horse at the head of the main street, her silver hair catching the morning light. No longer the phantom of war, but something more powerful. A symbol of what justice could look like when people chose to stand together. Impressive display. Colonel Blackwood's voice carried across the sudden silence. He rode forward alone, every inch the cavalry officer he'd once been. But ultimately futile. You're outnumbered. Am I? Victoria's voice carried to every corner of the gathering. Count again, Colonel. Not just the guns, but the hearts. Count the people who chose to stand in the light rather than hide in shadows. Blackwood's weathered face showed a flicker of uncertainty as he truly looked at what faced him. Not just the armed deputies and dawn riders, but the sea of determined faces. Every person who'd ever suffered under the boot of fear was there, standing tall. "These people are soft," he sneered, but there was something desperate in it now. "They'll break at the first sign of blood." "Like they broke at Miller's Crossing?" Victoria challenged. "Like they broke at Fort Pine. Your nephew thought the same thing about Shadow Creek. Though fear was stronger than courage, he was wrong too." Rattler was weak. Blackwood's composure cracked. He didn't understand that power isn't about making people fear you. It's about making them need you. "No." Victoria dismounted, walking forward. "Power isn't about fear or need. It's about choice. Every person here chose to stand. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because they've seen what's possible when people work together instead of against each other." She stopped in the middle of the street, directly between her people and Blackwood's Legion. "You're right about one thing, Colonel. The frontier needs order. But not the kind enforced by guns and threats. It needs the kind that grows from trust and cooperation. The kind that makes people stronger, not weaker." Behind Blackwood, his men stirred uneasily. They'd come expecting to fight shadows, but found themselves facing the light of day. Among them were faces Victoria recognized, men who'd once fought under Confederate flags, who'd learned the bitter taste of lost causes. "Your legion is built on shadows," she continued, her voice carrying truth like a torch. "But look around you. There are no shadows left to hide in. Every town you threatened, every person you tried to break, they're all here, standing together, in the light." One by one, Legion riders began to lower their weapons. They'd signed on for profit and power, not to fight against the very people they claimed to protect. The sight of communities united, standing firm without firing a shot, spoke louder than any gunfire could. "It's over, Colonel," Victoria said softly. "The war ended long ago. Let it go." For a moment, something shifted in Blackwood's eyes, a glimpse of the man he might have been, before war and bitterness twisted him. Then his hand dropped to his gun. Never. What happened next would be told and retold across the territory for generations. Blackwood drew with the speed that had made him legendary during the war. But Victoria didn't reach for her guns. Instead, she stood perfectly still, letting his bullet pass through the space where fear should have made her dodge. In that frozen moment, as Blackwood realized his shot had missed, dozens of rifles leveled at him from every direction. Not just lawmen and dawn riders, but shopkeepers, farmers, miners, ordinary people choosing to protect what they'd built. "Your choice, Colonel," Victoria said calmly. "Die here, proving that violence is all you know, or live, and help us build something better." Blackwood's gun hand trembled. In his eyes, decades of war and hatred warred with the undeniable truth before him. Finally, slowly, his weapon lowered. "What happened to you?" he whispered. "You were the Phantom, a killer, like me." "I found something worth more than killing," Victoria answered. "We all did." As dawn painted the sky in colors of hope, the Shadow Legion surrendered, not to the force of arms, but to the power of unity. The war that had haunted the territory was finally, truly, over. In the days that followed, change swept across the frontier like a cleansing wind. Towns that had stood alone learned to work together. Trade routes opened, schools were built, and justice took root in soil once poisoned by fear. Shadow Creek remained at the heart of it all, a living reminder that courage was contagious, that hope could overcome fear, that the greatest power wasn't in the guns you carried, but in the people who stood beside you. And if sometimes in the deepening dusk people glimpsed a figure with silver hair riding the boundaries of their new world, well, every legend needs its guardian. Not a phantom of war anymore, but a protector of peace, watching over the future that courage had built. The story of the Phantom became something else entirely. Not a tale of vengeance, but a testament to transformation. To the truth that even the darkest shadows could give way to dawn, if enough people chose to stand in the light. And in Shadow Creek, where it all began, they still tell this tale when the wind dies down and the night grows long. They tell it not to remember the darkness, but to celebrate the light that replaced it. They tell it to remind themselves that the greatest victories aren't won with bullets, but with hearts brave enough to stand together. They tell it because some stories need telling, again and again, until they become not just legend, but truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.